A black entrepreneur buys a bank in Texas to give his community a chance at a better future. But when the staff kicks him out, not knowing he's their new boss, they set off a chain of events that could turn their world upside down. Can he take back control and teach them a lesson? Watch until the end and share in the comments what you would do in his place. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, based on the true story of Bernard Garrett. Mornings in the small town of Grovesville, Alabama, were marked by a dull rhythm of routine. The town had a typical Southern charm. White-painted buildings with red brick foundations, the steady hum of an occasional car passing by, and the rustle of newspapers in the hands of men waiting for their morning coffee. But for a young black boy named Mark Henderson, Grovesville was a place where the very air was heavy with unspoken rules and silent barriers. Mark was 17, tall for his age, with a serious demeanor that belied his years. His clothes were always neat, even though they were second-hand, and his shoes, though worn, were polished to a shine, partly because of his work, but more so because he took pride in appearing sharp and presentable. Mark worked as a shoe-shine boy near the main bank in Grovesville. Every morning, he would set up his stand, a simple wooden box with a small stool for customers, just a few steps away from the grand entrance of Grovesville National Bank. The bank was a massive, imposing structure with marble columns and large windows that overlooked Main Street. It was a symbol of wealth, power, and, most importantly, exclusion. Mark knew this well. He had seen the disdainful looks the bank's patrons often gave him, the way they avoided eye contact, or how they muttered under their breath when they saw him lingering a bit too long. But Mark wasn't interested in their opinions of him. He was there for something far more valuable, their conversations. Mark's work allowed him a unique vantage point. He had figured out early on that people often talked the most when they felt unseen. As he shined their shoes, bank clerks, tellers, and even the wealthy clients would discuss everything from the town's gossip to financial transactions, market trends, and the intricacies of real estate. Mark had learned to listen, really listen, and pick up on details that others might dismiss as mundane. He had a small, leather-bound notebook that he kept hidden under his shoe-shine kit. Whenever he finished a customer and found a moment of solitude, he would quickly jot down snippets of conversations, numbers, percentages, and names. The book was filled with his observations, details about interest rates, property values, mortgage terms, and the workings of loans. For Mark, this wasn't just idle curiosity. It was a way out. Raised by a single father who worked as a janitor, Mark had grown up understanding the weight of hard work, but also the limitations placed on him by society. His father often spoke of the unwritten rules of the South, of how black people had to be twice as good to get half as much. Mark knew he was destined for something beyond the confines of Grovesville's segregation and limited opportunities. One humid summer afternoon, Mark was busy polishing the shoes of Mr. Thompson, a well-to-do businessman who frequently visited the bank. As Mark worked, he listened to Mr. Thompson brag about a recent real estate deal to another customer. Mark learned how the bank appraised properties and the kind of returns the bank expected from its investments. He was so engrossed in listening that he didn't notice a tall, stern-looking man watching him from across the street. A man who was not amused. The man was Mr. Avery, a chauffeur for one of the bank's wealthiest clients. He was a large, heavy-set man with a sharp, suspicious eye. He had noticed Mark before, always listening a little too intently to the conversations of the bank's patrons. Today, He decided to put an end to it. "Hey, boy," Mr. Avery's voice boomed as he walked over, his shadow looming over Mark and Mr. Thompson. Mark looked up, his heart skipping a beat. "You've been hanging around here long enough, eavesdropping on things that don't concern you." Mark, startled but trying to keep his composure, stood up. "I'm just doing my job, sir," Avery sneered. "Your job is to shine shoes, not spy on white folks' business. You better get out of here before I tell your daddy what you've been up to." Mark felt the weight of the threat. If his father found out, he'd be furious. His father had always warned him to keep his head down and avoid trouble, to know his place. Mark had heard this advice his whole life, but something inside him rebelled against it. He clenched his fists, swallowing his pride. "Yes, sir," Mark mumbled, lowering his gaze. He packed up his things and left, but the fire inside him only burned hotter. That evening, Mark returned home to their small two-room house on the edge of town. His father, George Henderson, was a quiet man, worn down by years of hard labor and the burden of raising a son alone after his wife had passed. As Mark entered, his father was already at the small kitchen table, his eyes narrowing. "What happened today, Mark?" George asked, his voice stern. Mark hesitated, but then explained everything. The conversations he had overheard, the notebook, and Mr. Avery's threat. His father's face tightened with concern and anger. "You think you're going to get rich listening to these white folks? You think they'll let you have a piece of their pie?" George's voice was sharp, his frustration evident. "They'll crush you, boy. They'll crush you and not think twice." Mark looked down but remained defiant. "I have to try, Pa. I've got to be smarter than them. I'm not going to spend my whole life on my knees." George sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "You're smart, Mark. Smarter than most. But smart don't mean nothing if you can't survive, and they ain't gonna let you get ahead. Not in this town." George paused, his eyes softening a bit as he glanced at the notebook Mark had left on the table. He picked it up, thumbing through the pages. The detailed notes, calculations, and observations caught him off guard. "You wrote all this?" he asked, his tone changing. "Yes, sir," Mark replied. George shook his head slowly. "You got a gift, son, but this place, it'll only break your spirit." That night, Mark lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. His father's words echoed in his ears, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant for something more. He had seen too much, learned too much to just give up. The system was rigged against him. That much was clear. But he also knew that knowledge was power. If he could just find a way to use what he knew, maybe he could turn the tables. A plan began to form in his mind. Grovesville was too small, too steeped in its ways. If he wanted a real chance, he would need to leave. Go somewhere where his skin color didn't define his potential as harshly. He thought of California, a place he had heard about in the conversations of travelers and traders. A place with opportunities, where a man could make his own way if he had the brains and the guts. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He'd need to save money, convince his father, and be prepared for the challenges ahead. But for the first time, Mark felt a sense of purpose that outweighed his fears. He wouldn't be confined by the limitations others set for him. He would carve his own path. As he drifted to sleep, he whispered to himself, "I'm going to change everything, one step at a time." The long train ride from Alabama to California felt like a lifetime for Mark Henderson, his wife Clara, and their young son Junior. For Mark, the journey was not just a physical one, but a leap of faith. Los Angeles represented a chance to rewrite his destiny, away from the suffocating grip of the Jim Crow South. But as the city came into view, its sprawling size and constant motion overwhelmed him with both excitement and uncertainty. Los Angeles was nothing like Grovesville. The city's vastness stretched as far as the eye could see. an ocean of concrete, steel, and opportunity. Skyscrapers, busy streets, and endless lines of cars painted a picture of a world where everything moved fast, and everyone seemed to be chasing something. It was a place where dreams were both made and shattered. Mark knew the stakes were high, but he had decided that the reward was worth the risk. The family settled in a small room in the back of a cramped house owned by Clara's uncle, Joe Carter. Uncle Joe had been in Los Angeles for nearly 2 decades, working as a custodian at a local factory. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with a perpetually skeptical look on his face. From the moment they arrived, Mark could sense Joe's skepticism toward his ambitions. "Young blood," Joe said one evening, his deep voice reverberating through the tiny kitchen. "You gotta know when to pick your battles. California ain't no different from Alabama when it comes to folks like us. Better get yourself a job at the factory. Make some steady money." Mark was polite but firm in his response. "Thank you, Uncle Joe. But I didn't come all this way to settle for what's given. I want to own something, make a life where Junior doesn't have to shine shoes or sweep floors." Joe laughed, a deep mocking sound. "Own something? In this city, white folks barely let you walk on their sidewalks, and you want to buy buildings. You're a dreamer, boy." Mark felt a pang of frustration, but he kept his composure. Clara, however, stood up for her husband. "Uncle Joe, Mark has a plan, and I believe in him. If it means we gotta struggle a little longer, then so be it." Joe's expression softened just a bit. "All right, but don't say I didn't warn you." Determined to prove his worth, Mark set out every day to explore Los Angeles. He would walk through different neighborhoods, taking note of the demographics, the condition of the buildings, and, most importantly, the signs indicating properties for sale. Each evening, he would return home and meticulously document his findings, much like he had done back in Grovesville. One particular day, Mark stumbled upon a modest apartment building in a predominantly white neighborhood. The building was old but sturdy, with a for sale sign posted by a real estate agency. As Mark stood in front of it, imagining the potential, he felt a tap on his shoulder. "Excuse me, sir. Can I help you?" It was a white man, perhaps in his mid-40s, wearing a suit and a suspicious expression. Mark straightened up and replied, "I'm interested in buying this building." The man looked at him incredulously. "Buying? You mean you want to rent?" "No, I mean buy," Mark insisted, keeping his tone steady. The man's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "You do realize this is a white neighborhood, don't you?" Mark nodded. "I do. But I also know that money's green, and I have a legitimate interest in this property." The man smirked, clearly amused by what he perceived as naivety. "Well, good luck with that. I doubt the owner would want to sell to someone like you." As the man walked away, Mark's determination only grew stronger. He knew it wasn't just about purchasing a property. It was about breaking a barrier, proving that he could carve out a space in a society that was designed to keep him out. That evening, Mark sat down with Clara in their cramped room, where the walls were thin, and every sound from the neighboring rooms echoed through. He explained his encounter with the realtor and his desire to push forward with the purchase, despite the resistance he faced. Clara, always his rock, listened carefully. "Mark, you know they won't make this easy for us. Are you sure this is the right move?" Mark nodded. "It's the only move, Clara. The black neighborhoods are overcrowded and bursting at the seams. They'll have to expand eventually. And if we're the ones owning property in the white neighborhoods, we'll be ahead of the game." Clara smiled, her faith in him evident in her eyes. "Then let's do it, but we might need help to get started." It was then that Clara suggested they approach her old acquaintance, Joe Mitchell, a black businessman who owned the popular jazz club Plantation in Los Angeles. Joe was known for his connections, his wealth, and his flamboyant style. But he was also known to be a bit of a playboy and a risk-taker. A few days later, Mark and Clara visited the Plantation Jazz Club, a place buzzing with life, music, and energy. The dimly lit room, filled with the sounds of smooth jazz, was a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the white-dominated business world. Joe Mitchell, a tall man with a confident smile, greeted them warmly, but his eyes quickly shifted to Clara. "Clara, it's been a while," Joe said, his grin wide as he leaned in for a hug. "Who's this fine gentleman you've brought along?" "This is my husband, Mark," Clara replied firmly. "We're here to talk business, Joe." Joe raised an eyebrow, glancing between Mark and Clara. "Business, huh? And what kind of business are we talking about?" Mark took a deep breath and laid out his plan. Buying properties in white neighborhoods to rent to black professionals looking to move out of the ghettos. Joe listened, but his expression turned to one of mockery. "So, you want to play in the big leagues, huh? You know they're not going to roll out the red carpet for you, right? You think just 'cause you got a little cash and some guts, they're going to let you into their world?" Mark's jaw tightened. "I'm not asking for permission, Joe. I'm looking for an investor who sees the potential in a market that's about to explode." Joe chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "I like your spirit, Mark, but I'm not in the business of charity. And let's be honest, you don't look like the kind of guy who'd fit in with the folks in those neighborhoods." Clara could see the anger rising in Mark's eyes and quickly intervened. "Joe, we're not asking for charity. We're asking for a partnership. You've got connections. We've got the drive and the vision." Joe considered her words, but then he leaned forward, his tone suddenly serious. "You want my money? Prove to me you're worth it. Bring me a deal that no one can say no to. And maybe we'll talk." Refusing to be disheartened, Mark continued his search for properties. After weeks of effort, he found an old apartment building on the edge of a transitioning neighborhood, a place where white flight was beginning and property values were dropping. It was a perfect target. The building needed renovations, but the price was within reach, just barely. Excited, Mark brought the idea to Joe, who, to his surprise, showed some interest. However, when Mark mentioned that he would need to negotiate directly with the current owner, Joe's demeanor shifted. "Good luck, but don't expect them to roll out the welcome mat," Joe said with a sly smile. "You might want to bring your white friend along for that meeting." Mark's heart sank, knowing Joe was right. Despite having the money and the plan, the reality of racial barriers was still there. He turned to his cousin Matt, a white young man he had met in Los Angeles, who had come from a poor background and understood the struggle of being an outsider. Mark proposed the idea of Matt acting as the face of their business deals. Matt was hesitant at first. "You're asking me to pretend to be someone I'm not, Mark. You think they won't see through it?" Mark replied, "They won't see what they don't want to see. As long as you speak their language and dress the part, they'll believe it." Matt, driven by the idea of being part of something bigger and wanting to prove himself, agreed. Together, they prepared for their first big negotiation. The day of the meeting came, and Matt entered the room with confidence, dressed in a sharp suit that Mark and Clara had helped him pick out. The building's owner, Mr. Riley, an elderly Irishman with a sharp wit, eyed Matt curiously. "Young man," Mr. Riley began, "what makes you think you can handle a building like this? It's not just about money, you know." Matt, following Mark's coaching, replied smoothly, "I understand that, Mr. Riley. It's about understanding the market and recognizing opportunities. We have a plan to bring in a new kind of tenant, black doctors, lawyers, and teachers who are looking to move out of overcrowded neighborhoods." Mr. Riley seemed intrigued but cautious. "And how do I know you'll be able to handle the community backlash?" Matt didn't flinch. "Because we're ready for it. And we're ready to pay you $30,000 now." and the rest in installments once the building is fully leased. After a tense silence, Mr. Riley leaned back and said, "You've got yourself a deal, son. Just make sure you don't mess this up." Outside, Mark and Matt celebrated their small victory. It was a step forward, but they both knew it was just the beginning of a much tougher journey. That evening, back at Uncle Joe's house, Mark and Clara shared the news of their success. Uncle Joe, however, remained skeptical. "So you got one building. What happens when the white folks start pulling their tricks, trying to run you out?" Mark, tired but determined, looked Joe in the eye. "We fight back, Uncle Joe. We use their rules against them." Clara took his hand. "We'll get out of this place, all of us, and build something we can be proud of." As they lay down that night, Mark knew that the path ahead would be filled with more obstacles, more prejudice, and more battles to fight. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path, the one he was meant to take. The city of Los Angeles, with all its contradictions, had become a new battleground for Mark Henderson, a place where he would either find success or learn how to fight, until he did. The deal with Mr. Riley marked a turning point for Mark Henderson, but it was only the beginning of a much larger journey. Purchasing a property in a predominantly white neighborhood was a bold move. But now came the more significant challenge, making it a success. Mark knew that he couldn't do it alone. He needed allies, resources, and perhaps most critically, a network of people who believed in his vision. With his first building under his belt, Mark set out to secure additional funding to renovate the property and purchase more buildings in similar neighborhoods. His strategy was simple but risky. Target underserved markets where black professionals, like doctors, lawyers, and teachers, were looking to move out of overcrowded black neighborhoods. However, to make this vision a reality, he needed an investor with deep pockets, and preferably someone who understood the stakes. Mark's thoughts kept drifting back to Joe Mitchell, the flamboyant owner of the Plantation Jazz Club. Despite their initial rocky encounter, Joe was one of the few successful black businessmen in Los Angeles who had enough wealth and connections to make a difference, and yet Joe's skeptical attitude towards Mark's ambitions still lingered in his mind. But Mark knew he had to give it another shot. After all, nothing ventured, nothing gained. One evening, after a long day of overseeing minor repairs on his new building, Mark decided to visit Joe's club again. This time, he was prepared to lay it all on the line. The Plantation Jazz Club was alive with music and chatter, the air thick with smoke and the aroma of whiskey and cigars. As Mark walked through the crowded room, he could feel the curious glances. A black man in a suit who didn't look like he was there for pleasure was a rare sight in this part of town. When he finally reached Joe's table, Joe looked up from his drink and smirked. "Back so soon, Henderson? What? Didn't get enough last time?" Joe's voice was dripping with sarcasm, but there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes. Mark took a seat across from him, his expression serious. "I've got something worth your time, Joe. I want you to be my partner." Joe chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, really? And why should I put my money on you?" Mark laid out his plan, detailing how they could corner the market by buying up properties in transitioning neighborhoods where property values were dropping due to white flight. He explained how black professionals were ready to move into these neighborhoods if given the chance, and how Joe, with his network, could help make it happen. Joe listened, but his skepticism remained. "You're talking about stepping into a world that doesn't want us, Mark. You know what they do to men like us when we start getting too big, right?" Mark nodded, unfazed. "I know, Joe. But we don't have to play by their rules. We make our own. And besides, you know the mayor. You've got connections. You can make things happen." For a moment, Joe looked thoughtful. Then he leaned forward. his expression serious. "All right, Mark, I'll consider it. But I need to see something solid, something that says you're not just another dreamer. Bring me a deal that's undeniable, and we'll talk." Mark understood this was the best offer he'd get from Joe. "Deal? I'll get you that deal." After the meeting with Joe, Mark knew he needed to find a property deal that was not only valuable, but would also demonstrate the potential of his business model. His plan required him to go where black men were rarely welcomed, to the offices of white property owners and bankers who controlled the city's real estate market. The only way to get his foot in the door was to use a face they trusted. Mark decided to approach his cousin's friend, Matt Sullivan, again. Matt was a young white man in his early 20s, sharp-witted but still somewhat naive. He had grown up in poverty, which made him more open-minded than most, but even he hesitated at the idea of fronting for a black-owned business. "Mark, you're asking me to step into a role I'm not ready for," Matt said, when Mark first approached him. "What if they find out? I could lose everything," Mark replied, with a quiet intensity. "What do you have to lose, Matt? A factory job, and a future that looks like your past. Or do you want a shot at something bigger? I'm asking you to be part of a change, something that matters." Matt thought about it, his reluctance fading as the idea of being part of something revolutionary took hold. "All right, Mark, I'm in. But you gotta teach me everything I need to know." The weeks that followed were filled with intense preparation. Mark and Clara transformed their small room into a makeshift classroom. Every evening they sat with Matt, teaching him the nuances of real estate transactions, explaining terms like cap rate, gross rent multiplier, and net operating income. They drilled him on property laws and city ordinances, teaching him how to talk, negotiate, and, most importantly, how to think like a businessman. Joe Mitchell, who had taken a cautious interest in their endeavor, even agreed to give Matt lessons on etiquette, golf, and how to converse with wealthy white businessmen. At first, Matt stumbled through the lessons, his nerves getting the better of him, but slowly he began to find his footing. His natural charm and quick wit served him well. One evening, after a particularly grueling session on financial ratios, Mark watched as Matt fluently explained the concept of leverage in real estate. "You're getting there, Matt," Mark said with a grin. Matt smirked back. "I had a good teacher." But beneath the camaraderie, Mark knew the real test was yet to come. They had set their sights on a new building, a larger apartment complex, located in an area on the brink of transition from a predominantly white to a mixed neighborhood. If they could secure this deal, it would be a game-changer. The day of the meeting arrived. Mark, Joe, and Matt had prepared extensively, but Mark's nerves were still frayed. The building owner, Mr. Charles O'Leary, was an established figure in the city, known for his shrewd business sense and deep connections within the white community. Mark and Joe had coached Matt to handle this meeting on his own, knowing that their presence could jeopardize the deal. Inside the lavish office of Mr. O'Leary, Matt faced his first real test. Mr. O'Leary was a tall, thin man with a sharp nose and a no-nonsense demeanor. He eyed Matt carefully, sizing him up as they began to discuss the terms. "So, you're interested in the building, huh?" O'Leary said, his tone casual but probing. "What makes you think you can handle a property like this?" Matt, following the plan, replied confidently, "We have a strategy, Mr. O'Leary. We'll be targeting black professionals, doctors, lawyers, educators, looking to move out of overcrowded neighborhoods. They're a stable market, and we're offering them something they don't have: quality housing in a better area." O'Leary's eyes narrowed. "And you think the current tenants will be okay with that?" Matt didn't miss a beat. There might be some resistance, but we're prepared for it. We'll improve the building, increase its value, and offer competitive rents. It's a win-win. The negotiations stretched on for hours. Mark and Joe waited anxiously outside, knowing that any misstep could cost them everything. When Matt finally emerged, his face was a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. "We got it," he said breathlessly. At $35,000, with a 20% down payment and financing the rest through monthly installments. He agreed to let us manage it on a trial basis. Mark and Joe exchanged a glance of disbelief. It was better than they had hoped for. Mark shook Matt's hand firmly. "You did good, Matt. Real good." However, success was often met with backlash. The news of the deal spread quickly, and the backlash from the existing tenants was swift. Some of the white tenants began moving out as soon as they heard about the change in ownership, fearing what they called an invasion. Others resorted to vandalism, breaking windows and defacing walls, hoping to discourage the new management. The police, predictably, were no help. When Mark reported the vandalism, they showed up hours later, shrugging it off as kids being kids. They offered no protection and left with thinly veiled smirks, warning Mark to be respectful of the existing tenants. Mark knew he couldn't afford to let fear take over. "We need to show them we're here to stay," he told Joe and Matt. "We fix the damages, we clean up, and we keep going." With their backs against the wall, Mark and his team worked tirelessly to restore the building and reassure the new black tenants who were beginning to move in. Joe used his connections to bring in skilled workers who were willing to help at a fair price. Clara, ever the steady hand, managed the finances, ensuring they stayed within budget. As the weeks passed, something remarkable began to happen. Black professionals, drawn by the promise of better living conditions, started moving in. With each new tenant, the building slowly transformed from a source of tension to a symbol of hope. Families began forming connections, supporting one another in small but meaningful ways. One evening, as Mark stood outside the building, watching children play and neighbors greet each other with nods and smiles, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about owning a building. It was about building a community, a place where people like him could feel safe, respected, and valued. Joe approached him, a rare smile on his face. "Looks like you were right, Henderson. Maybe this crazy idea of yours has some legs after all." Mark nodded, his resolve strengthened. "This is just the beginning, Joe. We're gonna keep pushing, keep expanding, one building at a time." As they celebrated their progress, Mark knew they were ready to approach Joe Mitchell again. This time, it was Joe who reached out, intrigued by the success of the first deal. He invited Mark and Matt to his office, not in the jazz club, but in a small, upscale building he owned downtown. Joe leaned back in his chair as they entered. "All right, gentlemen, you've got my attention. Let's talk about expanding this little venture of ours." Mark felt the weight of Joe's words. It was more than just a business partnership. It was an alliance that could change the face of Los Angeles, one property, one neighborhood at a time. As they laid out plans for the next step, Mark felt a sense of anticipation and hope. The road ahead was still fraught with challenges, prejudice, and risk. But for the first time, he felt they had the momentum to keep moving forward. They were not just fighting for buildings. They were fighting for their rightful place in a city that was changing, and they were determined to be the ones shaping that change. The initial success of the small apartment building had injected a newfound confidence into Mark Henderson and his growing team. The once hesitant partnership with Joe Mitchell had solidified into something more promising. The combination of Mark's strategic vision, Joe's connections, and Matt's role as the white face in their operations proved to be an unexpectedly effective formula. But now, Mark was preparing for the biggest challenge yet, buying a larger building deep in a predominantly white neighborhood where hostility and suspicion were almost guaranteed. After weeks of scouring the market and following the trends of white flight from inner-city neighborhoods, Mark identified a promising opportunity: a multi-story apartment building on the edge of a rapidly transitioning area. This building was different from their first acquisition. It was larger, more prominent, and located in a well-maintained neighborhood that had yet to experience a significant demographic shift. The owner was Mr. Howard Wexler, a wealthy, older man known for his conservative views and reluctance to sell to undesirables. The risk was higher, but so was the potential reward. If they could pull off this deal, it would establish them not just as opportunists, but as serious players in the Los Angeles real estate market. Mark was well aware that attempting to purchase a building in such an area was not just about business. It was a statement against the unwritten rules that dictated where black families could and couldn't live. Mark and his team knew they needed a careful plan. They had decided that Matt, once again, would be the face of the negotiation. His preparation had to be even more thorough this time. Over a series of late-night meetings, they rehearsed every possible scenario, every question, every objection Wexler might raise. They discussed market trends, property values, neighborhood dynamics, and even the social climate affecting property sales. Joe Mitchell, always a realist, warned them about the potential fallout. "Wexler's not like the others," he cautioned. "He's old school, doesn't like change, especially not from people like us. You gotta convince him that this is the best deal he's gonna get." Mark nodded. "And we're not just buying a building, we're proving we belong here." When the day of the meeting arrived, Matt was dressed in a sleek gray suit, his hair neatly combed, exuding confidence. He entered Mr. Wexler's office, a room lined with oak bookshelves and leather-bound books that spoke of old money and tradition. Wexler himself was a tall man in his 70s, with sharp, calculating eyes and a demeanor that radiated authority. "Well, Mr. Sullivan," Wexler began after the initial pleasantries, "I understand you're interested in the property on Hawthorne Street. Might I ask why?" Matt smiled politely. "It's a sound investment, Mr. Wexler. The building is well constructed, and the location is ideal for professionals looking for a quality residence close to the city center. I believe we can improve the property and attract a new wave of tenants, people who are willing to pay for quality and stability." Wexler raised an eyebrow. And what kind of tenants would those be? Doctors, lawyers, teachers, black professionals looking to move out of overcrowded neighborhoods. They're willing to pay a premium for a better quality of life, Matt answered, without hesitation, repeating the lines they had rehearsed. Wexler's expression darkened slightly. "I see. And you think the current tenants will just accept this change?" Matt nodded. "We believe so, with the right approach and management. We're prepared to invest in renovations and make improvements that benefit everyone." Wexler leaned back in his chair, contemplating. "And what's your offer?" Matt laid out their proposal: $70,000 for the building, with $50,000 up front, and the remaining $20,000 to be paid over the next year, contingent on a successful transition of the tenant base. There was a tense silence as Wexler considered the offer. He looked at Matt long and hard, then said, "You know, Mr. Sullivan, I've been in this business a long time. I've seen a lot of changes, some good, some not so much. I'll be honest, I'm not thrilled about this idea of yours. But business is business. If you can meet my price and terms, you have a deal. But I'm warning you, one misstep, and I'll make sure this city knows who's really behind this." Matt kept his composure. "Understood, Mr. Wexler. We'll make sure everything goes smoothly." The handshake that followed felt like a small victory. But Mark, watching from outside the office, knew that this was only the beginning. With the deal signed, Mark and his team wasted no time taking control of the property. However, as they began to inspect the building and plan renovations, the resistance they had anticipated came quickly. It started with cold stares and hushed conversations among the white tenants, followed by thinly veiled threats. One morning, as Mark was overseeing repairs with his cousin Matt and Joe, an elderly white woman named Mrs. Jenkins approached them, her face twisted with disdain. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, glaring at Mark. "This is a white building. You can't own this place." Mark, who had expected something like this, maintained his calm demeanor. "I'm the new owner, ma'am. We're just making some improvements to make this a better place for everyone," she scoffed. "You think you can just come in here and change everything? You people don't belong here." Before Mark could respond, Matt, who was standing nearby, stepped in. "Ma'am, I assure you, Mr. Henderson is the owner, and we're committed to maintaining the quality of this property." She turned her glare on Matt. "And what about you? Working for him, are you?" Matt didn't flinch. "I work with him, and I'm here because I believe in what we're doing." The woman muttered under her breath and stormed off, but it wasn't long before she returned with 2 police officers, their expressions stern and distrustful. "What seems to be the problem, ma'am?" one officer asked. "This man," she pointed at Mark, "claims to own this building. I don't believe it. He's trying to cause trouble." The officers turned to Mark. "Sir, do you have any proof that you own this property?" Without missing a beat, Mark reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folder containing the deed to the building. He handed it to the officer, who examined it closely. "Everything seems to be in order," the officer finally said, his tone begrudging. "But try to be more respectful to the tenants." Mark nodded, though his frustration simmered just below the surface. "Yes, officer. Sorry for the inconvenience." As the officers left, Joe turned to Mark, his face a mix of frustration and resolve. "They ain't gonna make this easy for us, Mark." "I know," Mark replied. "But we didn't come this far to back down now." The challenges only escalated from there. Over the next few weeks, Mark and his team faced constant setbacks: vandalism, harassment, and even an attempt to sabotage the building's plumbing. Each time, they repaired the damage and kept moving forward. Joe, who had his own network of connections, brought in workers who were willing to help at a fair rate, understanding that this wasn't just a business. It was a fight for something bigger. Clara, ever practical and supportive, took charge of managing the finances, ensuring that every dollar was spent wisely. She coordinated with suppliers, haggled for better deals, and even stepped in to help with the renovations when things got tough. One evening, after a long day of repairs, Mark gathered his team in one of the nearly renovated units. "We're not just fixing a building," he said, looking at each of them. "We're fixing a mindset. We're showing them that we have every right to be here, to own, to succeed. This is more than bricks and mortar. It's about changing how they see us and how we see ourselves." His words resonated with everyone present. They knew the stakes were high, but they also understood that they were on the front lines of a new kind of battle, a battle for equality and opportunity. The elderly woman, Mrs. Jenkins, who had initially confronted Mark, continued to make her displeasure known. She would glare at Mark and his team whenever she saw them, muttering under her breath about how things used to be better. But one day, she took her protests a step further and decided to move out, citing her inability to live next to colored folks. While Mark knew that her departure might cause a ripple effect among other tenants, he saw it as an opportunity. Within days of her moving out, they advertised the newly available unit to black professionals. The response was overwhelming. Within a week, a well-dressed black woman named Mrs. Davis, a nurse looking to relocate her family, moved in. Her arrival marked a turning point. Where there had been fear and resistance, There was now a sense of hope and possibility. The new tenant's presence also attracted more interest from black professionals who were eager to find quality housing outside the confines of segregated neighborhoods. The building slowly began to fill with new families, each bringing with them the promise of a better future. A few weeks after Mrs. Davis moved in, Mark received a call from Mr. Riley, the previous owner of their first building. Riley, impressed by the steady payments and the successful management of the property, offered to partner with Mark on future ventures. Over a cup of coffee in a small diner, Riley laid out his proposal. "You see, Mark," he said in his thick Irish accent, "I've been in this business a long time, and I know talent when I see it. Americans might be reluctant to deal with me because of my background, but you and we've both got something to prove." He proposed a partnership where they would buy properties together, using his reputation to secure deals and Mark's skills to manage and turn them around. They would share the profits 50-50ths. Mark, recognizing the opportunity, agreed. It was a new alliance that could open doors they hadn't even imagined. With Riley's backing, they could negotiate from a stronger position, gaining access to properties and financing that had previously been out of reach. That night, Mark and his team celebrated in the same jazz club, where their journey had taken a crucial turn. The atmosphere was filled with joy and cautious optimism. Joe, Matt, Clara, and even some of the new tenants gathered around, toasting to their achievements. Joe, who rarely showed emotion, raised his glass. "Here's to proving them wrong, one building at a time." Mark, looking around at the faces of his friends, his family, and the people who had put their faith in him, felt a swell of pride. "This is just the beginning," he said. "We've got a lot more to do. But tonight, let's just enjoy this moment." As the night wore on and the music filled the room, Mark knew there were more battles ahead. Legal challenges, societal barriers, and potential betrayal. But for now, he was surrounded by allies who believed in his vision. Together they would continue to fight against the odds, one step at a time. And with every step, they were not just building a business. They were building a legacy. The acquisition of the second building was a significant milestone for Mark Henderson and his team, but it also marked the beginning of a new era filled with even greater challenges and opportunities. The bold move into predominantly white neighborhoods was more than just a real estate strategy. It was a direct challenge to the status quo of segregation and discrimination. Mark knew that to truly make an impact, they needed to expand their operations, buy more buildings, and make their presence undeniable. Mark's partnership with the Irishman, Mr. Riley, opened new doors for them. Riley, with his established reputation in the real estate world, had connections that Mark could never hope to access on his own. Together, they began strategizing their next moves, looking for properties that were undervalued or in transitional neighborhoods where white owners were looking to sell due to the fear of integration. Mark and Riley often met in a quiet corner of a small diner, far from prying eyes. Their meetings were intense, filled with detailed discussions about market trends, financial projections, and neighborhood demographics. They mapped out their strategy on napkins, marking potential properties and considering the risks and benefits of each one. One evening, as they huddled over a map of the city, Riley leaned in and said, "You've got a knack for this, Mark. But you know, we're walking a fine line. Too many of these buildings, too fast, and we'll start drawing more than just attention. We'll draw trouble." Mark nodded. "I know, but the window of opportunity won't stay open forever. We have to act while we can, or we'll lose our chance to change things." Their new strategy was to focus on acquiring larger buildings with higher capacities in areas on the brink of transition. These properties were riskier to buy, because they were still predominantly white. But they also had the highest potential for long-term profit. The team decided to use the same formula that had worked before. Matt would act as the face of their business, while Mark, Joe, and Riley provided the expertise and backing behind the scenes. Each acquisition required meticulous planning and a deep understanding of both the market and the racial dynamics at play. They needed to ensure that every purchase was a strategic move, not just for profit, but also for advancing their broader goal of breaking down racial barriers in housing. One of the prime targets they identified was a sprawling apartment complex in East Los Angeles. The building was in decent condition, but had been suffering from poor management and a steady exodus of white tenants. It was a perfect opportunity for Mark and his team to step in, renovate, and bring in a new wave of black professionals seeking quality housing. Securing the East Los Angeles property was no easy feat. The owner, Mr. Frederick Lawson, was a tough negotiator known for his no-nonsense attitude and deeply ingrained prejudices. It was clear from the outset that Lawson wasn't eager to sell, especially to a buyer who planned to fill the building with black tenants. The meeting took place in a luxurious downtown office, with Matt once again taking the lead, backed by Riley's presence as his silent partner. Mark and Joe waited outside, knowing their presence could complicate matters. As Matt entered the room, he immediately felt the tension. Lawson was a tall, stern-looking man with a piercing gaze. He sat behind a massive oak desk, flanked by his two lawyers, their expressions equally stern. "What's this I hear about you wanting to buy my property, Mr. Sullivan?" Lawson began, not bothering with small talk. Matt, maintaining his composure, replied, "Yes, Mr. Lawson, we believe your property has a lot of untapped potential. With the right management and some renovations, we could turn it around and attract a new kind of tenant, professionals looking for quality living spaces close to downtown." Lawson's eyes narrowed. "And what kind of professionals are we talking about here? Doctors, lawyers, teachers, people who are looking to move out of overcrowded areas and are willing to pay for a better quality of life," Matt answered confidently. Lawson's tone turned colder. "And by people, I'm guessing you mean colored folks?" Matt didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir. The demand is high, and the market is underserved. There's a real opportunity here." Lawson leaned back, his expression one of disdain. "You realize that could cause issues, right? My tenants won't be happy." Matt, recalling Mark's advice, replied, "We're prepared for that, Mr. Lawson, and we're willing to offer you $150,000, $100,000 up front, and the rest over the next 2 years." The room went silent. Lawson's lawyers exchanged glances, and for a moment, it seemed like the deal would fall apart. But then, surprisingly, Lawson nodded slowly. "All right, Mr. Sullivan, you've got yourself a deal. But let's be clear. If this blows up in your face, don't say I didn't warn you." With the deal secured, Mark and his team quickly moved to take control of the property, but as they began renovations, they faced a level of backlash that they hadn't encountered before. The remaining white tenants, upon learning about the new ownership and the plans to attract black professionals, began to organize against them. They formed a tenants committee, which immediately started filing complaints with the city and spreading rumors about crime and devaluation due to the incoming black tenants. One day, as Mark, Matt, and Joe were overseeing the renovation work, a group of white tenants gathered outside the building, holding signs that read, "Keep our neighborhood safe" and "No to invasion." A man in his 50s, who seemed to be leading the group, stepped forward and shouted, "You think you can just take over our homes? This is a white neighborhood." Mark stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We're here to improve the community for everyone. We're investing in this building and this neighborhood. The man sneered. "We don't want your kind of improvement. You people bring nothing but trouble." Before Mark could respond, the police arrived, called by the protesters, no doubt. The officers walked over, their faces already set with irritation. "What's going on here?" The leader of the protesters pointed at Mark. "These people are causing trouble, trying to force us out of our homes." The officer turned to Mark. "Sir, we've been getting a lot of complaints. Maybe it's best if you and your crew leave for the day." Mark, holding his ground, replied, "We have every right to be here, officer. This is our property, and we're working to make it better." The officer's expression hardened. "I'm not going to ask again." Joe, sensing the tension escalating, stepped in. "Let's go, Mark. We'll come back later." As they left, Mark could feel the eyes of the protesters boring into his back. It was a stark reminder that no matter how hard they worked or how much they invested, the fight against prejudice was far from over. Despite the opposition, Mark and his team pressed on. They brought in skilled black workers from around the city to help with the renovations, ensuring that their investments benefited their community. Clara continued to manage the finances, stretching every dollar and negotiating every contract with a shrewdness that kept them afloat. Over time, as more black families and professionals began to move in, the building started to change. A sense of community began to develop among the new tenants, who saw in Mark not just a landlord, but a leader fighting for their rights. They organized gatherings, supported one another, and began to take pride in their new home. Mark often visited the building, talking to the new tenants, listening to their stories, and making sure they knew they were welcome. One evening, as he was checking on the progress of the renovations, he ran into Mrs. Davis, the nurse who had been their first black tenant in the previous building. "You know, Mr. Henderson," she said with a smile, "when I moved into your last building, I didn't expect to find a community. But that's what you've built here. A place where we're not just tenants, we're neighbors." Mark nodded, feeling a swell of pride. "That's what this is all about, Mrs. Davis. A place where we can all feel at home." However, their success did not go unnoticed by the city's established real estate moguls and local authorities, many of whom were not pleased with the changing dynamics. Soon enough, Mark and his team found themselves facing a new set of challenges. Legal ones. The city began to scrutinize their properties more closely, sending inspectors to find any possible code violations. Suddenly, minor issues became major fines, and permits that had been routine to obtain were delayed or denied. Mark knew these were deliberate attempts to frustrate their progress. One day they received a notice of an injunction filed by a local property owners association, claiming that their renovations were violating the neighborhood's historical integrity. The complaint was a thinly veiled attempt to slow them down, and Mark knew it. "We're being targeted," Mark said during a meeting with Joe, Clara, and Matt. "They're using every trick in the book to push us out." Joe nodded. "We need to lawyer up, Mark. We're playing in the big leagues now, and they're not going to pull any punches." Clara, always the strategist, added, "And we need to stay united. If they see any cracks in our foundation, they'll exploit them." Recognizing the escalating threats, Mark decided to rally the new tenants. He organized a meeting and spoke to them about the challenges they faced, making it clear that this was about more than just their buildings. It was about their right to live where they chose and to be treated with the same respect and dignity as anyone else. "We're up against people who don't want to see us succeed," Mark told them. "But if we stand together, we can show them that we're here to stay. This isn't just about a building. It's about our future." The tenants, inspired by his words, pledged their support. They formed a community association to address any legal issues collectively, contributing funds and resources to help fight the ongoing legal battles. Their solidarity became a powerful force against the harassment they faced. As Mark and his team continued to fight these battles, Joe Mitchell approached Mark with an intriguing proposal. "We've been focusing a lot on these local deals, Mark, but I've been thinking, what if we started looking beyond Los Angeles? There are other cities, other neighborhoods where we could replicate this model, places that might not be as entrenched as L.A. Mark considered Joe's words carefully. It was a bold idea, and it would require more resources and more risk. But if they could expand their operations, they could create a network of properties that would make them unstoppable. "You're thinking of taking this nationwide?" Mark asked. Joe nodded. "Why not? We've proven it can work here. We've got the knowledge, the network, and the drive. It's time to think bigger." Mark smiled, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Then let's do it. We'll show them that this isn't just a local fight, it's a national one." With their sights set on expansion, Mark and his team knew they were on the verge of something revolutionary. The battles ahead would be even tougher, the stakes higher, but they were ready. They had the support of their community, the strength of their allies, and, most importantly, the unyielding belief that they were on the right side of history. As they looked out over the city, they knew that their journey was far from over, but they were ready to keep pushing forward, one building, one city, one step at a time. Los Angeles had been a proving ground for Mark Henderson and his partners. They had faced down prejudice, legal battles, and outright hostility to carve out a place for black professionals in neighborhoods that had long excluded them. But now, Mark had set his sights on something even more ambitious, something that could change the game entirely. He wanted to buy a bank. Mark understood that real change wouldn't come just from owning property. It would come from controlling the flow of money. Access to capital was the real barrier keeping black communities from building wealth. In his mind, if he could control a bank, he could open the doors to home ownership, business loans, and financial independence for black families who were systematically denied these opportunities. Joe Mitchell, ever the cautious strategist, was skeptical when Mark first brought up the idea. "A bank, Mark? You think they'll just let us waltz in and take over?" Mark shook his head. "No, I don't, but we've already done what they said was impossible. This is the next step. We buy a bank, and we give our people a chance they've never had before." After months of research, Mark identified the perfect target, the Mainland Bank in Austin, Texas. The bank was struggling, its profits dwindling as the city's demographics shifted and the white clientele moved their money elsewhere. The owner, Master Robert Florence Sr., an aging patriarch with a legacy to maintain, was looking for a way out, but wanted to keep some stake in the bank to ensure his son, Robert Florence Jr., could continue working there. Mark knew it wouldn't be easy to convince a man like Florence to sell to a group of black investors. So, once again, they would need to use Matt Sullivan as the face of the operation. This time, however, the stakes were higher than ever. The negotiation was set for a hot August afternoon. The air was thick with tension as Matt, accompanied by Joe, posing as his chauffeur, entered the imposing building that housed the bank's headquarters. Mark and Clara waited nervously at a nearby hotel, knowing that any sign of their involvement could jeopardize the deal. Inside, Florence Sr. was seated behind a large mahogany desk, flanked by his son and two senior bank executives. His demeanor was cool and calculated, clearly a man used to being in control. "Mr. Sullivan," Florence Sr. began, his voice steady and firm. "I understand you're interested in buying the Mainland Bank. May I ask why?" Matt had rehearsed this line 100 times. "We see an opportunity to revitalize the bank by tapping into a market that's been largely ignored. Minority-owned businesses and black professionals who have been denied access to fair banking practices. There's a demand that's not being met, and we intend to change that. Florence Jr., a younger, sharper version of his father, scoffed. And you think my father's bank should cater to them? Matt kept his calm, knowing this was a trap. We think your father's bank should cater to anyone willing to put their money here. Business is business. Florence Sr. leaned back, eyeing Matt with curiosity. I see. And what's your offer? Matt presented their proposal. $500,000 for 80% ownership, leaving Florence Sr. with a 20% stake and keeping Florence Jr. on as a credit expert. The terms were generous, deliberately so, to make the deal more appealing. After a long silence, Florence Sr. finally spoke. It's an interesting offer, but let me make one thing clear. My son stays on, and if this goes south, you'll be the one holding the bag. Matt nodded. Understood, Mr. Florence. The handshake that followed was a tentative one, filled with mutual suspicion. As Matt and Joe left the building, Joe couldn't help but mutter, "This ain't over, not by a long shot." With the deal signed, Mark and his team wasted no time in taking control of the bank's operations. They immediately began to implement changes, offering competitive loans and fair banking terms to black clients who had been previously turned away or given predatory rates. They reached out to black churches, community leaders, and local businesses, encouraging them to bring their money to the mainland bank. But not everyone was pleased with the new direction. Florence Jr., who had hoped to inherit his father's bank and run it in the same old way, began to undermine their efforts at every turn. He whispered to the bank's existing white clients, stirring up fear and resentment, suggesting that the bank's new management was risky and untrustworthy. One afternoon, after a particularly tense board meeting, Florence Jr. approached Matt in the hallway. "You think you can just come in here and change everything? My father built this bank, and I won't let you ruin it." Matt, maintaining his calm, replied, "We're not here to ruin anything. We're here to make it better. And if you can't see that, maybe it's time you step aside." Florence Jr.'s eyes narrowed. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't your world. It never will be." The hostility soon turned into sabotage. Florence Jr. began secretly leaking information to the press about the bank's new practices, framing them as reckless and dangerous. He contacted white clients, encouraging them to withdraw their money en masse, warning them that the bank was now catering to undesirables. The strategy was clear: cause a bank run and force Mark and his team out. One day, as Mark and Clara were reviewing loan applications, a clerk hurried into the office, his face pale. "Mr. Henderson, there's been a sudden spike in withdrawals. We're losing deposits fast." Mark felt his stomach drop. "How fast?" "Dozens of accounts closed in the last few hours, sir. Mostly our older, white clients." Mark immediately knew this was Florence Jr.'s doing. He called a meeting with Joe, Clara, and Matt. "They're trying to force a run on the bank. We need to stabilize this fast." Clara, always the quick thinker, suggested reaching out to the black community immediately. "We need them to deposit, to show confidence in us. And we need to make Mark wasted no time." He contacted every black preacher, business owner, and community leader he could find, explaining the situation and asking for their support. He spoke at churches, community centers, and even on street corners, calling on the black community to stand together. "This isn't just about a bank," Mark told a packed church one Sunday morning. "It's about our right to be treated fairly, to have access to the same opportunities as everyone else. If we let them scare us off now, we lose more than just a bank. We lose our future." The response was overwhelming. Black residents and businesses began transferring their money to the mainland bank in droves. The withdrawals slowed, and within a week, the balance sheets began to stabilize. It was a powerful message. They would not be intimidated, but Florence Jr. was not finished. Unable to cause a bank run, he took another route. He contacted the Federal Reserve and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, suggesting that the new management was engaging in unsound banking practices. Within days, federal regulators announced an early inspection of the mainland bank's books. Mark knew this was a direct attack, a last-ditch effort by Florence Jr. to take them down. They needed to ensure that everything was spotless, every loan properly documented, every transaction above board. Clara, who had a meticulous eye for detail, took charge of preparing the bank's records. She and the bank's accountants worked day and night, reviewing every loan, every deposit, and every expense. Matt, who had grown more confident in his role, coordinated with the bank's lawyer to ensure compliance with every regulation. When the federal regulators arrived, they combed through the bank's records with a fine-toothed comb. The atmosphere was tense, every moment feeling like a ticking clock. But after days of exhaustive examination, the lead examiner finally spoke. "Everything appears to be in order," he said, almost reluctantly. "We'll be in touch if we find any discrepancies. But for now, you're clear." It was a small victory, but a significant one. They had passed the test, but Mark knew it wouldn't be the last. After the regulators left, Mark and his team breathed a sigh of relief, but as they began to plan their next steps, Matt approached Mark with a surprising proposal. "Mark, I've been thinking," Matt began cautiously. "We could buy another small bank, a failing one. Move all our black loans there. It would make the mainland bank's books look cleaner, less controversial." Oh, Mark was skeptical. "You mean hide the loans?" "Not hide, just separate," Matt argued. "It's a strategic move. We could control the narrative." Joe, always wary of anything that smelled like deceit, shook his head. "It's a gamble, Mark. One wrong move, and it could blow up in our faces." Mark knew Matt had a point. It was a risky idea, but it could protect the mainland bank and give them more control over their operations. All right, the ambitious plan to buy a second bank and separate the loans came with more than just financial risks. It was a high-stakes gamble that pushed Mark Henderson, Joe Mitchell, Matt Sullivan, and Clara deeper into a complex web of power, prejudice, and deception. Mark knew they were walking a thin line, but he also understood that sometimes, in order to challenge the system, one had to use unconventional tactics. The stakes were higher than ever before. If they succeeded, they could build a banking network that provided fair access to capital for Black Americans in Texas, a state where racial discrimination in finance was systemic and deeply entrenched. But if they failed, the consequences could be devastating: financial ruin, legal trouble, or worse. Matt's idea to purchase a smaller bank, the Bank of Marlin, was bold but strategic. The plan was to move the loans given to black clients, loans that Florence Jr. had used to smear the mainland bank's reputation, into the newly acquired bank, cleaning up the mainland bank's books and reducing scrutiny from regulators. After intense deliberation, Mark and Joe agreed to the plan, despite their concerns. The acquisition process was swift. Mark, Joe, and Matt worked tirelessly to finalize the purchase. Clara, who had become a master of the financial intricacies of the banking business, carefully orchestrated the transfer of loans. However, the decision to buy the new bank came with strings attached. Matt wanted more control. He had proven his loyalty and wanted his own chance to lead. "I want to run the Bank of Marlin myself," Matt insisted during a heated discussion with Mark and Joe. "I've been doing this with you guys for years. It's time I had my own shot." Joe was wary. "And how do we know you won't screw it up?" "I won't," Matt argued. "I know what I'm doing. And this way we have a safety net. If something goes wrong at one bank, the other is still secure. Mark, seeing both the potential and the risk, reluctantly agreed. "All right, Matt, you'll run Marlin. But remember, we're all in this together. One mistake could bring us all down." With the new bank in their portfolio, things initially seemed to stabilize. Matt threw himself into running the Bank of Marlin, managing the loan transfers and overseeing day-to-day operations. But unknown to them, Florence Jr. was already plotting his next move. Furious that his efforts to undermine them had failed, he sought to destroy them by any means necessary. Florence Jr., under the guise of a concerned businessman, contacted his connections in the banking industry and hinted that something suspicious was going on at the mainland bank. He suggested that the new management might be using fraudulent practices to hide bad loans, knowing full well that this would provoke another regulatory response. Within weeks, another federal inspection was announced, this time focusing on both the mainland bank and the newly acquired Bank of Marlin. The timing couldn't have been worse. They had just completed the transfer of loans, and Matt, eager to prove himself, had been less cautious than he should have been. When the inspectors arrived, they were relentless. They pored over every document, every transaction, and every loan. As Mark, Joe, and Clara watched from the sidelines, the tension was palpable. It soon became clear that something was wrong. The inspectors found discrepancies in the paperwork, loans that seemed to exceed the bank's capacity, questionable approval processes, and missing documentation. Matt, who had been managing the Bank of Marlin's records, was called in for questioning. Nervous and unprepared, he stumbled over his answers, and his mistakes only fueled the inspector's suspicions. It became obvious that Florence Jr. had orchestrated the entire situation by planting a corrupt lawyer in Matt's path, who had intentionally led him astray with bad advice. The lead inspector, a stern-faced man with a no-nonsense demeanor, finally turned to Mark. "Mr. Henderson, can you explain how these loans ended up here and why the paperwork is so sloppy?" Mark, trying to stay calm, replied, "I'm not sure, but we'll cooperate fully to make things right. I assure you, there's no intention to defraud anyone." But the damage was done. The inspectors seized control of the bank's operations, and within hours, a federal announcement was made. The banking licenses for both the mainland bank and the Bank of Marlin were being revoked pending further investigation. The banks were placed under FDIC receivership, effectively shutting them down. As the news broke, the media swarmed the banks, painting Mark, Joe, and Matt as reckless businessmen who had gambled with people's money. The racial undertones were clear, an all-too-familiar narrative of black men overstepping their bounds in a white-dominated field. The very next day, FBI agents arrived at Mark's home with arrest warrants for him, Joe, and Matt on charges of bank fraud and conspiracy. As they were handcuffed and led away in front of their families, neighbors, and reporters, Mark couldn't help but think of how hard they had fought to build something meaningful, only to see it unravel in the face of systemic racism and betrayal. Inside the holding cell, Joe was furious. "Damn that snake, Florence Jr. He's playing us like fools, and now we're sitting ducks." Mark, though equally angry, remained composed. "We're not beaten yet. They want to use us as an example. But we're going to fight this. We have to." Their trial was set to be a public spectacle. The prosecutors wanted to make an example out of Mark and his team, and it was clear that their case was about more than just financial misconduct. It was about race, power, and control. Mark knew they needed the best defense they could muster. They hired one of the top defense lawyers in Texas, an ambitious attorney named Charles Maynard, who understood the racial dynamics at play. "They want to paint you as criminals," Maynard told them during a tense meeting in the jail's legal room. But we're going to show that this whole thing was a setup, engineered by people who don't want to see black men succeed. The days leading up to the trial were grueling. Mark, Joe, Matt, and Clara worked with their legal team to comb through every document, every transaction, and every witness statement. They knew that Florence Jr. had manipulated the system, but proving it in court would be a Herculean task. As the trial began, the courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and curious onlookers. The atmosphere was charged with tension and anticipation. The prosecution wasted no time painting a picture of Mark and his team as reckless and deceitful businessmen who had put the entire banking system at risk. They called witnesses who claimed that the banks had been mismanaged, that loans had been approved without proper vetting, and that the new management had operated with intent to defraud. When it came time for the defense to present their case, Maynard was relentless. He exposed the racial biases in the banking industry, bringing in experts to testify about the systemic discrimination black clients faced when trying to obtain loans. He highlighted how Florence Jr.'s smear campaign had incited fear and panic among white depositors, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of instability. But the turning point came when Mark took the stand. Dressed in his finest suit, he stood tall and confident, knowing that this moment was about more than just his future. It was about the future of every black entrepreneur who dared to dream beyond the confines of segregation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Mark began, his voice steady, "I stand here today, not as a man who tried to cheat the system, but as a man who tried to make it fair for everyone. We didn't create this mess. We exposed it. And now they want to punish us for daring to play by their rules." His testimony was powerful, laying bare the hypocrisy of a system that pretended to be fair while actively excluding those who didn't fit its mold. As he spoke, he could see the faces in the jury, some sympathetic, some still skeptical, but all of them listening intently. Despite the compelling defense, the jury, composed entirely of white men and women from conservative backgrounds, was not easily swayed. After days of deliberation, they returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts. The room erupted in a mix of gasps, cheers, and murmurs. Mark, Joe, and Matt were sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for bank fraud and conspiracy. The media framed it as a victory for justice, but those who knew the truth saw it as another example of systemic oppression at work. As they were led out of the courtroom in chains, Mark felt the weight of defeat, but refused to let it break his spirit. He knew they had lost the battle, but the war was far from over. After the sentencing, as they were being transported to a federal holding facility, an unexpected ally emerged, Florence Sr. himself. The aging banker, seeing the fallout from his son's schemes, reached out to Mark's lawyer. "I've lived long enough to know when things have gone too far," Florence Sr. said in a private meeting with Maynard. "My son played a dangerous game, and now it's cost him too. He's lost his reputation, and this bank is a shadow of what it was." Maynard, seeing an opportunity, asked, "What are you proposing?" Florence Sr. looked grim. "If I testify that my son orchestrated this, and that the bank's failures were his doing, would it help their appeal?" It was a shocking development, but it was also their best chance at redemption. As they prepared for their appeal, Florence Sr.'s decision to testify in their favor brought a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was still long, and the legal system was stacked against them, but they now had a powerful voice willing to speak the truth. In their prison cells, Mark, Joe, and Matt knew they had to keep fighting, not just for their freedom, but for the idea that justice wasn't just a word reserved for those with the right skin color. "We've come this far," Mark said to Joe one night. "We can't stop now." We owe it to everyone who's believed in us. Joe nodded. Damn right, we do. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, they prepared for the next chapter of their fight. One that would take them from the depths of injustice to the possibility of a brighter, fairer future.